In reality, what they're saying is that that God, if God has to be able to will to be not God, if God's going to be all powerful, which is actually a contradiction. God can't. If we follow Occam in this view, we ask the question. Then this is where the conundrum comes up: can God make a mountain so large that he can't move? Well, that's a non-question. You're saying, can God not be God? No, God can't be God. That's not a real question. It's a hidden logical contradiction. If you didn't follow it, it does take some. Well, it took me a while thinking about it before where the light comes on. But the point is that in that we now think about God as just purely willing. It's God's will, right? And we have to conform to God's will, and it could change. Well, no, God's will can't change. God wills one time eternally. This is the foundation behind the Father who keeps his promises, right? God keeps his promises because he cannot not. He's not constrained in one sense, but fidelity is his very nature. That's what it means to be God. Everything that can come into being is good because it reflects God's perfection, right? What we understand as good is a little bit different in God. It's good because it comes from God. Because God, by definition, is good. It's not that he's not that kind of guy, he wouldn't be bad. It's that's being bad means that God has to not be God, which is a contradiction. So in our environment, we have this idea of God just imposing his will upon us, and we can't really do anything about it because he enslaves us when he creates us. That is really the relationship that Islam sees between God and those who are his subjects. They don't see God as Father. In fact, that's blasphemy to consider God as Father. Right? God is master, and we're slaves. And God imposes his will upon us for our good or not for our good. Depends on which imam you want to listen to. But it doesn't really matter. We just have to do it. But this is not the case. When God wills, he wills because it's good. He creates us after himself. When he wills things for us, it's because we need it. It's for our good. You see, we can't give God anything that he doesn't already have. I think we mentioned this before. God, right? Creation plus God isn't more than creation. So God doesn't change. The only thing, therefore, that changes is us. God calls us into a relationship with him. We don't hurt him. We can't hurt him. He doesn't lose anything if we refuse it. The only one that loses something is us. So when we talk about this, the covenant oath that is being sworn, the curses are simply saying that if we choose not God, right, if we choose ourselves, if we call curses upon ourselves because we aren't going to, or we know we're not going to, or we don't live up to the promises that we live, then we recognize that it's impossible, or we should recognize it's impossible to live then in this relationship with God. And all of the wrath, for example, that we hear described in terms of God's wrath in the Old Testament is simply the situation of human beings recognizing what it means to live outside of this relationship with the author of life, the author of love. The fruit of this relationship with God, right, is joy. It's freedom. The choice to try to be God without God. Right? I think, remember, we talked about there are two ways of being like God. Remember, we said we're made in the image of the Son, who receives himself and totally returns himself. And that's what we're made to do. The choice to receive ourselves but refuse to return ourselves is trying to be the Father. is trying to create our own reality. We can't create our own reality. All we can take is the creation that God has given us and break it. To do that is to live outside of that relationship with God, is to experience the fruits of that, which ultimately the fruit of love, the fruit of communion with God, is joy. The fruit of going it our own way is momentary pleasure. That's usually the motivation for it. The pleasure is not enduring. It's ultimately misery. It's despair. It is being being in the state that we weren't created for. In a certain sense, it's evil. It's non-being. All of this is important to realize that the covenant oath, therefore, the curses is that Israel calls upon itself, is recognizing that if we don't live up to the stipulations of what it means to be in a relationship, this is the way that whether each person understood this way or not, this is the way we have to understand it. The results of refusing to live according to what it means to be in a family with God, which is, after the pattern of the Son, to receive ourselves and to give ourselves completely back to God for our own good and for the good of others, is to experience curse. Right? It's to experience damnation. It has a remedial effect. We have to not view it as God's vengeance upon us. We might experience it that way, but God doesn't get anything from being vengeant. He is not vengeant in himself. Right? He doesn't get any. He has no need of any flesh. He doesn't need his pound of flesh. That's not what even though we may experience it that way, that really is Satan who is tempting us to interpret what our experience of being separated from him really is. We suffer spiritually, and when we suffer spiritually, we're a unity of body and soul, of spirit and matter. What happens to our body happens to our soul. What happens to our soul happens to our body. These aren't two separate things. So when we suffer spiritually, we will suffer bodily as well. We'll experience it as in bodily sensations. We'll experience it ultimately, sometimes we call them psychosomatic problems, right? As though the body and soul were two separate things, and that our body shouldn't be suffering because something is happening interiorly. But just the very modern view of psychosomatic really is the idea of body and soul. What happens to our interiorly will manifest itself some way bodily. It's not a surprise. It's only a surprise for modern ways of thinking about the human person, which are actually kind of reductive, not really understanding who the human person really is. So we have, as Moses said, we have two paths. We can choose life, which means choosing to live in accord with the way we were made. Or we can choose death. What is death? Choosing not God. Death ultimately is choosing to rebel against the Father. Death is wanting to be God without God. And our only option there is to turn inward. And that's exactly the opposite of what it means to be a human person. A human person is made in the image of the divine persons. A human person is one who fulfills himself only by giving himself away. It's a paradox in our fallenness. We think to give ourselves away is to lose ourselves. But it's exactly the opposite. To give ourselves away is to find ourselves, to fulfill ourselves. We know that from our experiences. Most of us have selfless experiences. We may not get to the point of purely selfless experiences, but anybody who has helped somebody else in any way that the person can't really do anything for you, but even if you don't even get a sense of appreciation back from that person, but if it's obvious to you that what you've done is help this person, you get this experience of joy. And it's like oh, that doesn't seem quite right. I seem to be getting more out of it than I put into it. In a certain sense, you are. Right? If you've worked in a soup kitchen, if you've had, well, anybody with children, anybody who's had children, especially with young children, when the only thing they can give back to you is bodily fluids, right? That you get this great experience of joy without expecting anything in return, doing things for them, loving them, because that is, right, infinite. We're participating, especially if we're in a state of grace, we're experiencing that really in an infinite way. It resonates with us because that's what we are created. We're actually authentically operating in the way that we were created. To the degree in any of our relationships we fall short of that archetype, of that fullness of what it means to be human, then the experience of joy will be reduced by an equal measure. Very rarely are we purely selfish in our relationships, but sometimes we are. And ultimately, when we get our way, we do it to get our way, do it to get certain things. We don't experience joy at all from winning. We experience momentary pleasure, but ultimately we're left empty. That's the way that it is in any time that we sin, because we are actually turning inward. And turning inward is the definition of misery, isn't it? Isn't that when we feel depressed, isn't that what we feel? We're alone. We're alone by ourselves. And the more we feel that way, the more depressed we can become. We can reach the point of despair. This is why we need to be around people. Even those that don't, right? We talk about two different kinds of personalities, those that get their energy from being around people, right? Extroverts, and those who get their energy from being alone. Even introverts need to be around people. Introverts need relationships. They're at perhaps more risk of falling into depression and despair because their inclination is to go away. But when we feel bad, when we feel depressed, when we feel sick, it's our inclination to move away from people. That actually is the exact opposite of what we need to do. Right? We're made for communion. We need to overcome that. That actually is counter-human. But the inclination for that is, I would say, spiritual warfare. It's primarily spiritual warfare. If we think of Satan, the demons, as pack animals, right? And we kind of pack predators, and we are sheep, right? We are made for one another. We're more herd animals, in a sense. Sometimes for the worst. But how do herds protect themselves? Being together. How do pack predators succeed? Well, they isolate one member of the herd where they are, right? Where that member is now more vulnerable. That's really the plan behind this temptation, to turn away. This is important, right? This has important applications for the spiritual life. When you see a loved one, if you see a friend who has this inclination when they're suffering to turn away, you can't say, well, I'll let them alone. I mean, prudence has to be, but you can't let them go off alone and forget about it. And continually encouraging this person, because that's exactly what they need. That's exactly what they need at the time, is to continually calling them back, making them understand. You can't force them, of course, but making them understand they're not alone, helping to convince them that they're not alone, to help overcome the temptations that it is that they're experiencing. So all of this then, right, communion made for one another. The story that Scott Hahn gives us then for how this is carried out in salvation history. That with the very beginning we have this covenant that is formed between God and man, with Adam and Eve. And we don't know the time scale, but apparently, at least from what we read in Scripture, almost immediately it is, right, ruptured. But in Genesis 3:15, as we will see, God brings about this covenant renewal. this promise that what is ruptured, it's not exactly clear how, but what Satan, the grand old serpent, did from of old, he will be crushed ultimately. The rupturing of this covenant relationship will ultimately be healed from the woman who would come. And if we look at it in terms of this search for the woman, who the serpent also is looking for, right? He wants to destroy the woman. There is this process of man being told what is necessary for this relationship. And the story is consistently one that in our current state we cannot live in accordance with that relationship. It's impossible. And there's such a violation of the requirements of that relationship that there is a need for renewal. It begins, the next one is Noah, right? And the next one after that is with Abraham. And the next one after that is with Moses. The next one after that will be with David. And what we see in these covenant renewals that he points out is that this is one place I will quibble, I suppose, a little bit with him. If you're a Scott Hahn aficionado, don't throw anything at me. But I think it is better to, he talks about beginning with a husband as the head of the covenant. In a certain sense, that's true. Okay, with Adam. Then with Noah, he says father. But afterwards, I think he's a little bit too early in saying once we go to Abraham, we have a chieftain. Because I think there we still have a father. In fact, that's Abraham's name, the father of multitudes. Chieftain almost gives us a sense of what's coming. What's coming is that this God the Father forms covenant families, and he has a father here that exercises his fatherhood here on earth in his stead. In a nuclear family, it's the same thing. What we will see when we get to Moses is the first time I think it's true not to put father. I think what belongs to fatherhood is priest, prophet, and king. Those are the three offices of fatherhood, three aspects of fatherhood. By Moses' covenant, we will lose the priesthood. The father will lose the priesthood, and we'll talk about why that is as we go along. And so Moses becomes the prophet king governing his people, prophet teaching the truth of his people, but now the priest, the offering of sacrifice, right, mediating sacrificially, is fall into the line of Aaron. When we get to David, by the time we've gotten to David, the office of prophet and king have been separated. And so with David we have father king. And the Levites are still the priests, but now we have a distinct class of prophets. It's with Jesus Christ that fatherhood will be brought back together. And Christ now, again, isn't just king. He is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, but he's also the high priest, right? And he's the prophet like unto Moses, the prophet that some of the tribes of Israel are looking for. If you see, though, that the reason he does that is he's showing that the covenant grasp that begins with a marriage, that then goes to a family, that then goes to a tribe and a nation. It's expanding in who is, after the fall, who's included in this covenant. And just the trajectory shows that eventually this will be a universal covenant. Everybody will be called into it. A universal family, a Catholic family. I think that's probably a good summary, or at least a summary. We probably could open it up for questions if you have any.
So you said it breaks off with Moses?
With Moses, what we see in terms of the leader, the human leader of these covenants, with Moses, if we see the threefold priest, prophet, and king, the first of those threefold offices we lose with Moses is priesthood. Moses' brother, Aaron, his older brother, is now in his covenant, the line of Levites are the priests. And so it no longer belongs to Moses, who's the leader of this covenant, to be a priest. He's a prophet and a king.
But with
Abraham, all three are still together. He's still the father. He is the priest, prophet, and king. Yeah, interestingly enough, we'll talk more about who the heck Melchizedek is. And that's you're supposed to laugh. We'll talk. But Melchizedek is the priest of God Most High. But he blesses Abraham. Right? What's going on here, I will say, that Melchizedek, just a foreshadowing, Melchizedek is not just a king. He's also a priest. He's offering sacrifice. He's offering the sacrifice of bread and wine. But he's also the prophet, the one who teaches. The office that he has, he's giving to Moses. There is what's going on with Melchizedek is actually Abraham. He's giving to Abraham a covenant blessing. Abraham will have this covenant renewal, but Melchizedek is the linkage between Noah and Abraham, and who is overseeing the covenant. There's actually extra biblical evidence that that's the case.
And then can you do the same thing with David? So you re-explain Moses and re-explain David.
Okay.
What part falls away?
Yeah. By the time we get to David, we actually have David is no longer prophet. Prophet isn't. Remember, the prophets arise out of the period of Judges. Samuel, who actually is kind of both operating as a prophet and priest, ultimately he's not the first identified as a prophet, but he is really the beginning, I think, of what we would consider then the class of prophets. Though Moses, is clearly the prophet. He promises the Messiah in Deuteronomy 18. The Messiah was going to be a prophet like him, like himself.
So why the split?
Why the split? Yeah. Well, the split, as we will find out, as we peel this more away, is that Israel is called to be. They are called up until the time of Moses, the firstborn. The firstborn is the firstborn son. The firstborn sons, as we see as we go along, the firstborn sons are to be the fathers, the faithful fathers, after the image of the Father. Now, in the Old Testament, they don't understand the Trinity. They do have a sense of God as Father, but a Father as adoption. They don't understand the interior life of the Trinity in the way that we do now. But they recognize that God is kind of a father over Israel. It won't be called Israel really until Jacob, but I'll try not to give too many precisions. But they are supposed to be a father leading offering mediation between their family and God. Individual families, the covenant family, right, which is all of Israel. And Israel is the firstborn son of the nations. The firstborn son of the nations, meaning that all of the other nations are supposed to be in this relationship with God as well, but they are not. Israel, as the firstborn, is supposed to be leading as offering mediation of the other nations between them and God as a priestly people. They were called priestly people up until Moses. They were called to teach God's ways. This is what a prophet does. It's supposed to teach God's ways. And the kingly office is to govern in accordance with God's ways. as we go through the covenant line, we'll see that Israel didn't lead as a nation, they weren't faithful in leading the other nations. They weren't faithful in leading themselves in God's ways. They were disobedient. After the fall, they didn't have the capacity to be obedient. And it's the same with the individual priests, or individual fathers over their families, and the covenant father over the covenant people were also disobedient. And the disobedience rises to such a level that the first separation that we will see will be the golden calf incident. The golden calf incident, Israel considers the golden calf for Jews, for the Jewish people, equivalent to what the fall of Adam and Eve was for all of humanity. This radical rupture of this relationship. And God is very clear to Moses that what is happening here. He says that what belonged to the what belonged to the firstborn sons, is to be given to the Levites. Right? This was the priesthood. They were the ones that had this priesthood through disobedience.
Punishment was the result of, he was punishing by saying, now the Levites get it.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a teaching, a remediation, right? The Levites were the ones who proved themselves faithful. They were the ones who demanded the people in a rather visceral way, I suppose, but return to the worship of God rather than to the worship of the golden calf. So disobedience is the reason for the fragmentation, the loss of this office of that firstborn sons had. Because it wasn't just over the covenant people, that same authority had belonged to individual fathers as well. Individual fathers offered sacrifice for their families with God. It was actually always, up until Moses' time, sacrifice it wasn't a requirement, it was an optional gift of a way of giving back, of renewing really this covenant. So this will be the story of the Old Testament. These covenant renewals are because of Israel corporately and individually, members' disobedience. Disobedience meaning rebellion against the Father, against God, as well as against really our own good.
So then it gets to David and it splits again.
It actually is split before David. Remember Samuel. Samuel will be the one who actually anoints Saul as king. Saul is really the first time that that prophet and king will be split. And then David will be anointed king. I think you'll catch that too.
I kind of just saw it as society grew, you had that's the introduction of the contract, which is different than the covenant. That's just kind of the way I saw it. So you end up having the story of the contract and law and human stuff separating from the covenant. And it's both in the same book, just like it kind of is in our society today. We have a legal system and a moral system. And they're supposed to kind of be the same, but they're not. Just my thoughts.
Yes.
So in terms of the curses, do we believe that they're metered out to the people that were involved in violating the covenant at those different phases? But then there's also this eternal curse that only Christ can sing and
right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Is that the curses? They certainly are presented in the Old Testament as God sending them directly, but in another way of understanding it, there is the natural consequence of being out of relationship with Him. It's the natural consequence because all the curses don't come directly from God because that's not His nature. But in our violation of this relationship with God, it's not, right, the mediators of those curses are those that had rebelled against God initially, right? It's spiritual warfare. Without this relationship with God, we don't have the protection of grace, the natural protection of grace. The spiritual warfare is, we are, in a certain sense, as human beings, we can't enter into the fight because we lose every time. The spiritual warfare that's ongoing before we have access to grace again is with, is in the angelic world. Our protection really is coming from the angelic world. This is why the Old Testament is talked about as mediated by the angels until the New Covenant, when it's now mediated by, right, men who have been raised above the angels, and now because we've been divinized. We have the life of the Holy Spirit now returned within us.
Just to underscore that, or to get it so I get it, there was no grace in the Old Testament, so there was no protection, but there was mediation or protection from angels.
Yes, yeah. There was grace in the Old Testament until Adam and Eve. We had original grace, and with that, with the loss of that original justice, that original grace, of course, we get concupiscence. Concupiscence is the fancy term that we introduced before. It's simply, the shorthand of it is that we are inclined to sin. But I didn't show you the picture of our souls, did I? Before. This is a secret. You can't tell anybody this. But what you didn't know, but I think this is a very helpful way of understanding all of this. What you didn't know is that your soul looked like a snowman. Did anybody tell you that?
No.
That's the secret. Yeah. Luke knows this. Right?
Is this the seventh covenant? I need my memory
Or
refreshed.
the seventh covenant.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
Is it just Luke though that looks that way? Or
Okay. These are perfect spheres. If they don't look perfect from there, it's because you're too far away. As you get closer, they look better, I think. Okay, and there is these spheres, right? 3-dimensional. This is a shaft going down through them. Right? So they're 3-dimensional. What you see here is kind of, it's a cutaway, but this is trying to show you a shaft going through them. The bottom sphere is what we call the affects. The affects are the things that affect us, the things that move us. Right? Our emotions, our appetites. We need them. They're good. Right? Our appetites are very important. Our emotions are very important. If we, I think I was talking earlier about, to Luke, about my mom, who's more or less lost her appetite in her old age. If we had not experienced that, most of us have experienced something like that when we're sick. We don't feel like eating. In fact, we have to force ourselves to eat. Right? Now, somebody that had never experienced that would think that's impossible. What do you mean you have to force yourself to eat? That's a natural thing to do, right? But apparently, without a nutritional appetite, we wouldn't eat, even though we know we're supposed to. We actually have to force ourselves to do it. These are good things. They're important things. But our appetites, our emotions, are not instincts. Animals have instincts. We could call these urges or inclinations. The difference between an animal that's not personal is that their urges, they just are to respond to. They have no intellect. The intellect is the faculty, it's a spiritual faculty. Only spirits have an intellect. The intellect is that by which we know right from wrong. We know things. We reason through our intellect. You see, our affects are made to be subordinated, to submit themselves to the intellect, because only the intellect can tell whether or not, right, that cup of coffee is good for me or not. The affects know, oh, yes, it's good. Right? It makes me feel good. It gives me energy. It's my appetite's drawn towards it. But after the second cup, then the intellect has to tell the affects that, okay, yes, same good as it was the previous 2 cups, but now it's no longer good for you. Right? It's an apparent good, but it's no longer an authentic good. Only the intellect can make that judgment. Without making that judgment, what happens? I lose my ability to say no. Now I'm on the 5th cup of coffee because I can't say no to it anymore. So the intellect, we're happiest as an organism, because even though I may achieve pleasure from that 5th cup of coffee, I lose the ability to say no to myself, not just for that coffee, but in every other area as well. And I then start to say, I wish I had willpower. I'm not free having done that. I have lost my freedom. So that wasn't freedom by continuing to go against what the intellect is telling me that I should do. The will is the top. Now, these are perfect spheres because in this model, because spheres don't balance on one another generally. Right. The size and the order represents really the hierarchy. But the bottom sphere is larger because that's the way we kind of experience the affects. They are the ones that are most demanding. They're not meant to be able to say no to. That, if we not being able to say no to, is the natural state. That's the way God intended it. But the natural state also is to submit themselves easily to the intellect. Now, in this state, this is a state of initial integration, the way we are before the fall. I would not be tempted to have this second cup of, or the 3rd cup of coffee, if the 2nd cup of coffee was what the intellect tells me is the end, that is enough. The affects wouldn't have kept bothering me, like, nagging you. No, we want more. We still want more. They would have said, okay, well, you're just saying it's good, but okay, you're telling me it's not good. They naturally submitted themselves. What's necessary for these spheres to balance upon one another is something to hold them together. This shaft through the spheres represents the fact that we were made for something. We need something that doesn't belong to our nature, for our nature to operate rightly. That was original grace. Human nature has always been made for grace. That's what this red line represents. This, whatever you want to think about, this energy being, or whatever, in this model. It's holding this integration together. This is the natural state. When we were cut off from God, we lost that grace. And so, what happens? Well, nothing is holding those spheres together. And so they've collapsed. We now have the appetites on the same level as the intellect. They no longer easily submit. It now is a task for the appetites, the emotions, the affects, to be trained by saying, how do you train anything? By a habit of saying no to it when it's inappropriate. Anytime we say yes to something that we know is wrong, we lose any kind of integration, any kind of virtue that we have built. This is basically what we do with children, or don't. Spoiled brats are those that, right, that have this emotion that they've never been taught to say no to. And how do they respond to it? Well, it doesn't feel good. That's the way our appetite works. It gives us this energy, this feeling that says, you can't stay here. You have to go do something about it. And the appetite is ordered to a particular good. The only way we habituate ourselves is living through, saying no to it, is living through that. And even with a spoiled brat, a spoiled child that you hadn't trained, you can help and need to help to train to say no to themselves. And eventually they'll become happier. Right? Because they will learn what it means to be able to have freedom. Freedom from having to follow the inclinations that pop up randomly. So this is what concupiscence means. Human nature has not changed, it's the same as it was, but it's not integrated in the way that was intended. And so living in accord with what it means to be free, what it means to be human, had been a natural reality, and now it's a task. It's an ongoing task that if we're not continually moving forward, then we're falling behind. There's never a neutral choice. Every choice we make either builds more virtue, more self-mastery, or we lose it.
That was a very good ending thing, because it makes me think of Sheen. I've always had trouble with the concept of freedom is freedom not to sin, but it didn't. I've always had trouble understanding that because there's something counterintuitive about that. But this is a perfect way of understanding it. That it's freedom from not having to just blindly follow our appetites.
Exactly.
And that does set us free.
It does.
Yeah, I like it.
Free from the misery, despair that we get when we're enslaved to them.
Is Adam and Eve, is that supposed to be like
Yeah.
like a story that's not really true, or how, is it symbolic, or what's the take on all that?
It's a real story of something that really happened, but the exact historical details are not. In fact, we know that the historical details of there are not exactly the way that they were carried out. But everything that is being described is revealing to us some truth of an event that really happened, but not necessarily exactly in the way that it was described.
So more symbolic.
Yeah, it's really what mythopoetry is about. We use the term myth as something that's false. That's only a recent interpretation of myth. Myth is a true story, right, about real events that have happened, except that the way that it's being told is really in kind of an archaic language, a way of describing things that are telling us the events, the importance of the events of the story, but not focused on what the events themselves actually may have been. Does that make sense?
So I got a question. I'm probably one of the guys that's gonna have a harder time like grasping some of this. Like this makes sense to me, but I think it's what I struggle with. Is kind of you brought up a question about Adam and Eve, and in the beginning of this conversation, you talked about God doesn't make mistakes, because if God made a mistake, then God would not be God. But
Yeah.
I mean, you look through the course of the Bible and history, and you see the flood. You see, why would He give us immortality only to take it away moments later, right? Through the Adam and Eve story. So it's my question, and you kind of hinted, I think, on last week when I listened to the podcast. Our fallacy as humans is to look at God's love for us, to say, maybe we look at our love for children and try to relate the two. But I mean, that's kind of where I'm at right now. My relationship with God is such that my love with my children, I think, is perfect. But do I always make the right choice? No, like I make a mistake. And so I'm that guy that's trying to relate that to my relationship with God, God and Jesus. So I'm kind of stuck.
Yeah, I mean,
If that makes sense.
no, I understand. I think I understand. There's an analogy between your love for your children and God's love for you and your children and all of us. But there's a greater difference, right? He loves perfectly and we don't. We can't yet love perfectly. Not till we get into heaven will we be able to love perfectly. So there may be very little selfishness in the way that, but there still will be some selfishness. Part of the way that you act towards your children and others is going to be, in part because of the way we feel. Our emotions are drive us to act in particular ways, and you can tell when your emotions no longer, and if you get to a point of anger with your children, and those feelings, you no longer are driven to, many times we'll do things out of anger that aren't necessarily in their best interest, but satisfy. And when we realize that later, we should repent, we should make restitution. But God isn't that way. God doesn't change, only we do. So when we read the Old Testament, one of the things that we have to realize in the Old Testament is the Old Testament, what it is teaching us are truths. Everything in it is true if we understand what it is teaching us. But Paul told us how we have to understand the Old Testament. That we have to understand what's being taught in the Old Testament in the light of Christ. He gives us this analogy when he talks about how the Jews, how Israel understands the Old Testament. He says that they see what is being presented, what God is being revealed, as of Moses taught from behind this veil. There's a veil in front of their faces. The image there was when Moses had come out of the tent of meeting God. He had God's reflected glory in his face, and they were not yet ready for it. And they told Moses to put a veil. He said that even today, they are still, when they read the Old Testament, they still are hearing it as of behind the veil. Not until Jesus Christ is the veil lifted. Not until Jesus Christ can you really have the interpretive key to figure out what God was really telling them. Because a lot of it is encrusted in their ways of understanding things. To get at the core of what they're talking about, we have to understand it in light of Christ. Jesus made this very clear when he talked about understanding the New Testament. He says nothing is being done away with. I'm fulfilling it. But it was said in the old, it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I'm telling you, that's a misunderstanding, of what it was. So he's helping to pull away, or to decrust, if you will, the truths that from what they were encrusted in the Old Testament. So as we go along, there'll be many opportunities to try to figure out, as we talk about, what these things really were, what was really happening, and what God was really teaching us, and how they came about.
Okay, we need to close.